What about Yellow Jackets?
Yellow Jackets is so good.
Is it?
Yeah. Yellow Jackets, they claim that they have a 5-season plan that they pitched to the network and they know exactly what's going to happen. And I believe them based on how they've done everything. 2
Interesting.
seasons so far, very good. Yeah.
Interesting.
That's also a show you're going to struggle with when you skip 10. Too many characters and too many time jumps.
Yeah, but then I just watch it so many times that eventually it fills in.
Good grief.
Like, I'm watching a scene in Dark.
Right now, as we record this?
No, before. And I was like, I've never seen this scene before.
Oh my God.
I don't even know who these people are.
Oh, we should take television away from you. You shouldn't be allowed to do things badly like this.
No, I think I watch television just fine. I actually probably get more out of it than people who just watch it the one time all the way through.
That is incorrect.
Yeah, because I'm going back and I'm like seeing the subtleties and the layers.
Yeah, that's called a rewatch. Plenty of people just do normal rewatches.
I don't have that kind of time. No.
Welcome to Acceptance Criteria, where we talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of how software gets made and how we can all do a better job together. My name is Kevin Thomas Euland, and across the chat from me is Andrew Greener. Say hi, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew. We're also here to get deeper in the human element. I could go on for an eternity about people and how they think about the process of building complex systems. And I can't think of two better people to do that than Kevin and I.
Which is why we really need to get some more guests booked on here. If you've got a topic you'd like to come discuss or rant about, drop us a note and we'll see if we can get you on a future episode. You can go to acceptancepod.com/guest and submit your ideas. And a quick reminder, whether this is your first episode or you've been listening for a while, we wouldn't say no to your going and dropping 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leaving us a nice review. And if you want to leave us a bad review, remember the name of the podcast is My Brother, and Me. Also tell your friends if you like the show and that they should check it out. Some of the best podcasts out there go by word of mouth, and we'd much appreciate it.
And a friendly reminder that we are always interested in hearing questions directly from you, our listeners, for our segment User Stories. If you've got a scenario you'd like help with, whether it's working with an engineering or product team member, trying to figure out how to solve an agile process problem, or you just can't understand why your favorite app updated everything and is now terrible, we're here to talk it through with you. You can send those questions to acceptancepod@gmail.com or submit them on the Discord in the User Stories channel, and we might be able to help on a future episode. And we're happy to keep it anonymous so no one can trace it back to you if you end up talking to a coworker or something.
On this week's show, we'll hopefully help some people out with some more Reddit questions. But before we get to all of that, let's take a short break and we'll be right back. All right, welcome back. This is a segment we like to call User Stories, where we'll eventually hopefully be answering questions that you, the listener, send in. But for now, I think we found some interesting questions on Reddit that we can tackle. All right, Western Amphibian 158. Dealing with executive amnesia. And their question is... Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Did you say Western-amphibian?
Oh, sorry. Yes, Western-amphibian, no hyphen 158. If you're a product manager or leader who interfaces with a VP of product, CPO, or CEO about projects in flight, how do you deal with busy execs who seem to always forget key decisions that were made a few months back? And I think this is a fundamental... This has nothing to do with being in product. This is a question for engineers. This is a question for anybody who reports and has to present to executives. There's a ton of key skills in here that I think are going to be important. I see you've highlighted part of it. I'm guessing you have a thought.
Yeah, because I think, if we were to sort of holy grail the biggest anti-patterns, right? Like, I don't know whether this is an anti-pattern in itself or whether it's just the battleground, like the hundreds of thousands of dead engineers over the years working in like that digital friction. But this is a big one I hear consistently, like for 25 years. It's many different flavors, right? Like when it's communicated to you, like the guys at the top change direction a lot, or we don't know what we're working on. We don't know what the company got. This one,
right?
Yeah, this one's fundamental, like big break.
Well, so a couple of parts to this. I think one, there's a lot of people who don't understand what they need to change about their communication style when they're talking to executives who you have 30 minutes on the calendar with this person. You don't really even have that 30 minutes. The first 5 minutes, they're still coming out of the last meeting that they were in. And the last 5 minutes, they're thinking about the next meeting that they're going in. Do I wish executives were better at that? Have I worked with executives who are? Yes and yes. It's the exception, not the rule, when you find that person. That's just a side effect of having four people in the company who have all of this decision power over so many decisions. I don't know what, there's a bigger corporate conversation here about like, should you really, are we effective when we have so few people trying to keep so much in their brains? Probably not, but that's the situation most of us find ourselves in. So the first thing I came to for like working with new product managers, working with new engineers, is you're on the hook for changing your communication style. You've got to figure out, how do I boil this, massive concept? You have 18 pages of documentation and user stories and UX designs and all of that kind of stuff. It's a real skill set that you have to work on to boil that down to, you get maybe 3 to 5 bullet points. And that seems inefficient and bad, and I'm not arguing that this is a good way to run a company, but this is the reality of the situation you're in. Your communication style has to be, how do you boil this down to the most key points that you need to sink into their brain, and recognizing that they're gonna give you limited RAM of their own mind, and you need to figure out how to optimize for the space you're given, and that is boiling it down to key things and key points. The other thing is, when you do that, you need to make it very clear what are those outcomes you're asking for those people, and making it very clear in the meeting. This is where I think a lot of meetings, this also goes to meetings and the problems we have with meetings. No one's very clear about the outcome of a meeting and the task and the action and the decisions. And so you've got to make it explicitly clear, especially with executives. Like, one of your final slides needs to be decisions I'm looking for, and in front of them, share your screen and type what you're hearing from them and make them all see. Like, it sounds pedantic, and it kind of sometimes is, but like, this is my recommendation to anybody I've ever mentored, which is, it's good actually to just share your screen, share your notes, and get everybody recognizing that we are putting 3 bullet points. These are the decisions we agreed to. This is the thing you just told me are my marching orders. I'm going to post that in the Epic, the user story, the Confluence page, the PowerPoint that you all refer to. Like, it is just, it feels a little, I think maybe one of the things people get hung up on is like, well, they're senior leaders. They're smarter than that. They don't need you to hold their hand like that. No, actually, you need to do, and you're not infantilizing them. You're not being a jerk by doing it this way. You're recognizing the limited time and limited mental bandwidth you're getting from people, and making things explicit. Everything should be explicitly outlined and defined. And I don't know, that's my overall, just in general, is like, I think this is my recommendation for meetings in general, regardless of whether you're an executive. Share your screen and share your notes and make everybody agree and say, yes, we've agreed to this decision. And then there's a secondary problem, which is 6 months later, they forget that they did that, and that'll be part 2. But do you disagree or agree with anything I just said in
No,
part
no,
1?
I was just thinking, and I hope you don't cut it, but it's also good to use big words like tremendous and just point out how much winning there's going to be. Say things
Right,
like,
absolutely.
there's going to be so much winning. So anyway, here's my take on that. I don't disagree with anything you said. That you and I will agree until the end of time on comms and meetings and
Right.
like execs. You get the first few minutes, and yeah, rightly so. They're human, right? So they're thinking about the last high pressure conversation. They're thinking about the next high pressure conversation, and you're sort of bringing things from the field that they're hoping they delegated. And the ideal world is like, I've done 99%, and they're just signing off, right? But it's never that. It's never
Right.
that simple.
Well, but I do think that there's a part of that, which is like, I've been in conversations when people are freaking out that they haven't had the face-to-face with the VP or the CPO or the CEO, and they're like, do they know that that's a thing? And it's like, actually, I've done my job effectively. I have a level of trust with that person that they, like, that's another thing that you should be looking for your leaders to develop, is trust amongst themselves. So you don't need to have, you can know that the CEO trusts your VP of product. When you and your VP of product decide a thing, you're good. And that's also a thing that doesn't exist a lot of the times, because people are humans and need to work better on this. But that's another thing, is that delegation should work. And if it doesn't, that's a separate issue. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, it's funny because I've always thought of the places where I'd like the culture the most, and I shouldn't be so broad. I don't mean the full culture of the company, but
Sure.
the synergy between product and tech. And it was when there was alignment between the two leaders, right? Like there
Right.
were still challenges lower down, similar kind of things that you'd experience in all companies. But when there was leadership, it kept the exec in check, right? Where it's like, product's telling me this. It's like, yeah, I was there with product. We
Right.
told you together, like you did ask for
Right.
this 3 months ago. I love that. I love it when you've got like a product and tech mature leadership. Them siding with each other is not necessarily the value, right? But yeah, I've often enjoyed that environment where there was good solidarity between those two, and then the communication to the higher ups then became a lot more consistent.
Yep.
The one thing that I think about with this is, and I always use the example, we're going to break into the LATAM market, right? Like that's our company vision for Q4. And then that vision then translates to, and we're going to do that by, here's the vision, the
Right.
action, right? And then that needs to be broken down. Well, that platform can't handle that volume, so we have to scale that platform. And this other stuff that we need doesn't exist to go to the LATAM market, so we have to do that and blah, blah, blah. I think the connection breaks. I think the connection breaks often between that vision and then the breaking down into work, right? And I've seen
Sure.
companies do a good job where they're a mess and they start the other way where it's like get all the work just tagged or labeled with the project or the business sort of function it's associated with, which is kind of like what enterprise architects do when they get somewhere, right? Is they start auditing over time and like, yeah, all this infrastructure here is associated with this business and blah blah blah. So that's the break for me. Like we don't. It's a difficult one to imagine though, right? Like you get this business vision and then very quickly you've got to break that down to sort of work, but you're also agile. So you've got to be ready for something else coming down the wire very, very quickly where you've got to get a lot of different groups to sort of suspend the work they were doing and flip and be agile. And I think we skip from business vision to technical to meet that
Right.
velocity.
Well, I think I've said this in a couple of our episodes, which is I'm not sure that they're forgetting the key decision. I think, to your point, the connective tissue from we've always wanted to break into the LATAM market in Q4. We've always wanted to hit revenue of product category X in Q1. Like the goal has always been a thing. And then because there's a disconnect from how are you going to hit product category X revenue, the strategy in January was Y. And then they think, oh, because now the strategy is pivoted and we think the way to get to that revenue is through path Z, everyone's like, oh, they forgot that we were doing, Y.
Right.
Why are we now doing Z? And it's like, no, no, no. You're the ones, and it's everyone's fault. This is not singling out any group. It's everyone along the chain failed to make sure that when you thought of strategy Y, it was for goal revenue in product category X. And now that we're trying to get to strategy Z, the goal is still revenue in category X,
Yeah.
right? And so like that's where I think a lot of these disconnects come from is, to your point, the people trying to figure out the day-to-day implementation lose sight of the actual business
Yep.
goal that they're trying to get to. And that's where I don't know that Jira and Confluence and all of these tools are helping people in the day-to-day task. Is your user story clear to you what the 3 levels higher business value is? I'm not sure it is to everybody. And I think that leads to some of this too.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out might actually relate to some of the, again, a consistent problem no matter where I be, in big, small, doesn't matter. That priority, and it can happen for a couple of reasons. One is, you're potentially slowing down and you're pivoting on some work. But if that message, and there's no ceremony, right? There is no sort of talk and agile about that, the actual action of pivoting the work, right? So there's
Right.
sort of an assumption that, oh, well, companies should just be really good at that. Companies are not good at transitioning anything, right? Like, big
No.
companies, it's not easy to just say, yeah, cool, and you're on your own for how you sort of slow down the work here and then transition to this new work because you want to be agile, and then you wind up with like so many projects where the priority is not clear because this one never really closed. There's
Right.
engineers who are actually like, I'm still working on it, but I don't. It's the priority the same because now there's all this other work coming down. There's obviously other reasons that can happen, but I think there's definitely situations where this can lead to that where the company pivots, but the guys fighting the war don't realize, like, wait a minute, we're in Cambodia now? Like, when did that happen? That was a
Right.
reference for anybody who doesn't know. Vietnam reference, Cambodia. So just showing how worldly I am.
The Vietnam War, not only in
Let's
Vietnam.
just say, as a Brit, your wars are as important as my wars. So I like to track them both.
Well, I do think there is a second part of this, right? Which is there is a legitimate your executive team, depending on the size of your company, the scope of what's going on. This is a thing that's true for startups and large companies. They do sometimes forget that that was a decision that they made 6 months ago, 3 months ago, whatever it is, and some of that is again just on that chain of relationships and leadership and making sure that you are being clear of I documented the decision, put it in a place that I can constantly refer to.
I want to hold you right there because you said it.
Yeah,
I documented the decision, and I want to paint a
right.
reality in life where if every decision in life was documented, there'd be a lot more accountability,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Like
Right.
every decision,
No.
yeah, absolutely. That to me, you hit the nail on the head when you said that. That is part of the problem is the forgetting of, and you've seen we've seen the ambiguity for 3 decades, right? Like where you go into a meeting and you're like, are we clear on the action items though? Like we're sort of talking,
Right.
we're dancing around these sort of two, three, four, five technical things, but no one actually said who was going to go do them and what they were actually going to go do, right?
Right.
This one sounds like it's 4 more hours of conversation, right? Like so
Right.
what are we ditching on the engineer? Yeah, this is a fundamental problem.
Well, and I think there's degrees of this which are my brain, I think your brain probably immediately jumps to like, okay, Microsoft Teams is trying to adjust this by having like the notes section and the to-dos that can come out of that and all of that kind of stuff. My brain jumps to like, what's the software solution to this? And I do think that there's not going to be a software solution to this in the next 2 years. Even if tomorrow you and I were like, oh, that's a good startup idea, let's go do
Yeah.
that. It's right. Like, so for the next 2 years, everyone needs to be personally accountable all time. All people always need to be personally accountable. So it's this weird balancing act in my mind of like, you could do that today. You could choose to go into your meetings and be the squeaky wheel and be the person who's like, great, we have 5 minutes left. I want action items, decisions coming out of this. What are the next steps? I do think that there's a thing that our software doesn't support this. This goes a little bit to the digital friction conversation. The software we use to do all of these things doesn't support this. There is no easy way to take the notes in the meeting and convert that into a thing that becomes a to-do list item for 3 of the people in the meeting. Not everyone in the company's using a to-do list to manage their time. There's a version of this where I go like full process dictator, and I get that human beings are human beings and don't want to work that way, but part of me is like, maybe you should. Maybe I should be forcing everybody to do a certain thing and be like, we're all going to
No,
use Microsoft to do. We're all going to have that integrated into the Outlook calendar appointment thing. I don't know. Like there's a version of this where I do get frustrated that there's personal accountability and then there's just like, nah, man, I'm telling you how you're going to manage your day because it sucks that you don't.
I think there's enough evidence to suggest beyond. I mean, I could get philosophical here. We could talk about human nature, right? But
Right.
there's enough evidence to suggest there are some things in software that just require risk and compliance always, right? Like, and that to me is one of them where it's like if you sort of throw it under the arm of compliance and say you're responsible for operational loss, right? So we want to make sure like meetings, like the software should ask, are you sure you have your action items? What are they? Right? Like
Right.
I absolutely think we are ready for that, right? I did see that with Google, by the way, though. I did see in Google
Hmm.
Meetings that they do summarize the meeting now. There is a feature that will
Okay.
summarize the meeting, and I have seen some AI right now where we'll actually rip through the transcript and sort of pull out the bullets. So we're going there
Sure.
because it's one of the most obvious productivity burns, right? So
Right.
I predict for the next 5 years we're going to see some really.
I just don't have any faith that Microsoft and Google are going to be the ones who, I don't know.
I trust Microsoft.
Sure. I will say there was a thing that so a couple of years ago at a company, we were on Microsoft Teams, and I don't know if this was a feature someone had to turn on, but it would prompt you and say, hey, you have 5 minutes left in this meeting. And it was a nice little prompt to be like, oh, we got to wrap it up. We got to figure out what the next action items are. I would have loved for it to go the next mile and be like, you have 5 minutes left. I'm muting everyone for 5 seconds, and I'm putting up in front of everybody the to-do list app, and you're all going to get, right? Like there's degrees of me wanting to just go full, like, okay, good. This is what your next step is going to be. I don't know. Anyway.
And it's difficult too. And I think this is sometimes where enterprise architects can be frustrated and people can be frustrated with enterprise architects, right? For example, someone can say, oh, hey, and by the way, I need, a database tech or I need this tech. And it's like, but we haven't talked about requirements. We haven't talked about like volume of data, the frequency of access, like what type of data, like
Right.
You haven't told me anything, right? Like, so, and I think if that kind of communications, then it creates a weird sort of dilemma where it's like, oh well, EA slowing us down because now they want to talk about the schema and the frequency of access, and it's like
You got to talk about it at some point,
you got
man.
to talk about it with somebody at some point, right? Like,
Right.
someone's going to slow you down, but hopefully, we're the guys who slow you down and you get the right database. The other guys
Right.
are going to slow you down, but you might not get the right database. Like,
Right, and then you have to redo it in 2 years, and
yeah.
now yeah, no, agreed.
Yeah, it's funny in a way. You and I beating a dead horse, right? But yeah, the
Yep.
communications and AI is going to fix that, though.
Well, so the thing I was going to bring up at the end here is everything we've talked about so far is great for remote teams. This is not trying, this doesn't solve you're in the actual conference room with the 5 executives. You're in it from any type of meeting, executive amnesia, all the way down to just general meetings. When you're in the room, what are the software tools? Is Microsoft Teams Notes app like locking the physical conference room door until you all decide on your action items?
It's funny in a way because I actually think, and I don't know if we'll go there in my lifetime or your lifetime because we're not that far apart. But I actually think the challenge is the process needs to be recognized as a system, right? And so when I think of the extreme, it's like somebody like Sarbanes-Oxley coming in saying, "Yeah, we don't just care about your software. We want to see the audit. Like we want to see the ticketing
Right.
system, and we want to see the documentation in the names of people that are part of this escalation, and we want to see how the calculations. We want to see the 47 calculations that were in this one calculation that made up this number at the end. Like there's a lot of auditing that goes into that. Engineering's not really like that. We've got like sort of security frameworks, and now we have like the source control and SAST and DAST and scanning, code complexity tools. But actually, the process of making software isn't really regulated, right? It's like do
Right.
it however you want. One of the interesting things when I was in aviation was we used to get a lot of interns from FIU, and I used to go do the intern day where they demo all the kind of really cool stuff that the technical schools were doing. But the guys I was always most impressed with were the guys at the building. They were doing the physical buildings because they had the physical project plans. But it felt regulated, right? It felt like, man, if I was to like look at this as a foreman, if something was missing, I would be like upset. Like what? There's no mention of the electricity and when they're coming and all the wiring and voltage and all that kind of stuff. I was always impressed by how regulated those project plans were. We don't
Sure.
have any of that at all.
No.
Just in the same way you can't say, here's the inputs to the meeting and guarantee the outputs. We don't have that for the process too, which is sort of like guaranteeing the stages through the SDLC, which is kind of
Right.
interesting, which is in EA, that's kind of the holy grail, right? Is to build yourself into the SDLC along with DevOps. They've been battling that for 10, 15, 20 years
Right.
now. SecOps, that's started to change to DevSecOps, SecDevOps, whatever you want to call them. Everybody's trying to get into the SDLC. DevOps is probably done the best job because it's the most relatable, like, hey, infrastructure as code, right?
Right.
The other disciplines have had a hard time getting into the SDLC.
Finance, FinOps wants to do that too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, yeah.
Another great example, FinOps, who come in and are like, yeah, but like, how much does it cost per customer a month to run this stuff? And engineers are
Right.
like, oh, we don't know. It's like,
Uh.
that's important. We don't even know how
Exactly.
much to bill because like we don't know. So yeah, again, FinOps. So that's another one.
Yep.
Okay, next question. This is from Kunu. That is KUNNU_1.
The underscore is important.
Yes, it is. Yes.
As I've been editing our past episodes, that you call me out every time I don't hit an underscore.
Yeah, we don't want Kunu1 coming after us and saying I never said that.
Right.
I'm sorry, I won't give you all of this, but let's give you the important bit. So we've got, hi everyone, I've been following this group for a while now, and this is obviously the enterprise architecture group versus the product or engineering. And they're saying, I'm currently working as an enterprise architect, and my role involves working closely with different business units to help them formulate strategies based on their needs. A big part of my day-to-day is attending governance meetings and, of course, asking the tough questions, especially when discussions veer too much into solutioning without a solid business context. So super relevant to my last couple of years. This comes up a lot. I'm really
Yep.
interested in hearing from others in the field. What does your day-to-day look like? What types of artifacts do you typically produce? And what are the main outcomes and outputs of your role? And how do you balance between strategy and solutioning? So yeah, this is a good one. It's a good one because maybe the challenge for me is, again, it's environmental, right? So you're setting up an EA organization and there are gaps, and the only way to fill them is to hoodwink and you build a team within your EA organization to do some of the implementation, right? So I've done that in the past, and then I've worked in straight EA where implementation for the EA guys is the worst thing in the world, right? So day to days based on jobs change a lot. I think what's interesting about Kunu underscore one's question is in the first sort of paragraph about the governance meetings, asking the tough questions and then veering into solutioning without a solid business context. So I think this is one we've talked about previously too. There's two elements to this. There's the big one, which is the business context, like the business vision for the year or the quarter or however long it is, translating down to technical conversations, what we might call discovery and design, right? So a lot of my day is that, and again, the challenge for us would also be not solutioning, right? So often we'll get to design conversations where there are boxes pre-populated in the design, and we'll say, well, how did you know? Like, how could you make that decision on picking the tech? Sometimes people just put placeholders in there. So sounds like we have a similar day to day already. I think what's interesting for a lot of enterprise architecture teams is how you're working with the other and shared services or enterprise service teams, right? So is your enterprise architecture team all of the disciplines like DevOps, Cloud Ops, enterprise architecture, data architects, your network and infrastructure architects, right? Because I think that can then influence your day to day a little bit more. Like you might have more control within enterprise architecture around the entire design. A lot of the times, my experience has been that you're fragmented. So the enterprise architecture teams are broken out into groups. Then your day to day is a little bit more challenging because you're actually sort of filling this weird PMO sort of project management role where you're chasing teams from you're chasing other silos and trying to loop your process into their process. But their process is sort of a black hole because they're IT teams. So they don't have the notion of SDLC or Kanban. So yeah, it really depends on your climate. And I've seen like from the very toughest challenges where you are fragmented with the enterprise architecture teams, all the way to sort of the best case, some of the big companies that I've been in that had a really good program around like enterprise architects and enterprise service teams being consolidated. And then the process, the SDLC taking into account the processes of those groups. So yeah, it's a broad answer, but it's often climate and environment that you're in that will dictate what your day to day. You and I talk a lot about the inputs and outputs, so that's probably a good thing to talk about, but I'll let you jump in as well because you have lots of experience in this.
Yeah, I mean, so two things jump out. One, in the comment, the actual question from Kunu underscore one, they put in here, my day to day is attending governance meetings and, comma, of course, comma, asking the tough questions. And I would just like to point out that I wish more people in all roles were actually asking the tough questions. And I think enterprise architecture tends to find the people who understand and appreciate that they are at a level where you can't let the wishy-washy non-answer float for very long. There's versions of, I don't know, we're going to wave our hand, we'll figure out that when we get closer to it. That's sometimes okay, but the of course asking tough questions, I'm like, oh man, I wish everyone thought, of course I'm asking the tough questions. I think that is a product management thing, that is an engineering lead thing, that is an enterprise architecture thing of, are you actually challenging the thing you're hearing in this, or are you afraid to rock the boat and you don't want to be the squeaky wheel while we're trying to get to the new solution? And so my only comment on that was just going to be like, man, I love that they said of course, and I would encourage everyone to take that mindset of, are you challenging the things you're hearing? And I think that is a thing that enterprise architecture has to do.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past too. Like, there's nothing worse than being in those sort of yes man meetings, right, where there
Right.
are no tough questions, there's no pushback. It's all just sort of, oh, this is a great update, what a great demo, and it's like, come on, guys, like, are we
Right.
gonna challenge each other here? Like,
Or it's silence and just you have no one stepping up to say, okay, I think it needs to be a Postgres database that goes and runs through an API layer. And then someone comes in and says, yeah, but are you thinking about, the concurrency of blah, blah, blah? Like, those silence is also equally bad to the yes men. I need active conversations
yeah.
that challenge each other, and you don't have to be a jerk about it, but make sure that you are actually probing what is being proposed and that you guys are building the right thing.
I've always liked and I often quote it like the 10th man rule in this one too. Like if everybody's in agreement, like just be the 10th man just for the hell of it. And
Sure.
for listeners who don't know, the 10th man, the concept is essentially generally it's if everybody's in agreement, the 10th man will play devil's advocate and argue against the consensus, right? So I've
Right.
always liked the 10th man rule because it did imply that there would be some friction from at least the 10th man, right?
Sure.
So I like that. It just feels like it forces that a little bit. But yeah, the tough questions, like, and actually, it's funny too. Like, they're not always tough because of complexity. They're tough because quite often EA gets the reputation of like, oh, it's slow down. It's like IT
Mhm.
tickets and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, okay, but there's fine. We have to make it part of the process and streamline it and make it really efficient, right? Like working with enterprise architects. However, not asking the question at all is far worse to me, right? Like that's how you
Right,
end up
like
with proliferation of tech, right? Is
right, you like someone has to notice that that third team over there is entirely based off of a vendor and we don't have direct access to the APIs.
yeah,
So you all proposing an API layer that helps the other two teams is great, but what are you going to do for the third team that's entirely dependent on a vendor providing their infrastructure for them? And that's not an option. That's not creating a blocker for the sake of process or red tape or someone feeling important to get the approval in. That's why you have enterprise architecture, because the people trying to solve their problems aren't thinking of others. Through again, that's not criticism of them. You're not in a role, you might not even know about that team existing over there.
yeah.
This isn't a startup. There aren't 8 of you all just deciding what to do.
Yeah, and I've only worked in one enterprise that tried to tackle the hey, what are the components we have across the company? And this was back in this had to be '04, '05, and it was great. It was and I loved it because it sort of solved the challenge for engineers that work in the enterprise where it's like, how do I even begin to search this company for
Right.
the encryption algorithm that this platform was built on because this company wants some custom development and I need to match the encryption, right? Like it's amazing to me that the proliferation hasn't given birth to this concerted effort by big companies like we have to audit what we have, right? Like because the whole time you're not auditing what you have, you're most likely somebody somewhere is diverging, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's an endless cycle, and the yeah, we've talked a lot about the challenges of that, but we see it all the time, right? Like big companies where big heavy services, and maybe they have 3 or 4 versions of that across the different domains. Some can be a little macro version within the domain, and then somebody's
Mhm.
doing it at the enterprise. But it's a challenge to for those engineers to even if you find out about like, oh great, these guys are probably doing it the right way with the right technology. Now you got to do the cross team and enterprise. And I always tell engineering teams, what you've built is great, but when you try to take this to the enterprise, you're going to be surprised. It's going to take you 10x the amount of time than what it took you to build it because
Right.
you got to train people. They're going to have issues like support issues. So
Legal is going to notice that you allowed admin root access to all the engineers, and that's not good for security and client data
yeah,
practices. Like,
that's
yeah,
exactly right. And that's what goes back to what I was saying about the disciplines too, is like you would expect a decent enterprise architect, even if it's not their discipline, they're going to recognize the entry point. And just like you say, hey, data's moving or data's at rest. So there's the security, there's the compliance governance around data, right? So good enterprise architect will sort of bring those things in and loop those guys in if it's not already under their sort of
right.
management. So yeah, there's a lot holistically. And actually, we talk about this one frequently too, right? Like it's not just tech, right? It's how prepped is this organization to handle this technology? So you'll often see it early with the audits of like, what's our maturation? Like the enterprise architect's favorite word, right? Like maturation.
Mm.
Maturation level 1 on APIs, maturation level 1 on AI technology. So it's often where we start is looking at the organization and say, cool, I really want to do this really amazing thing at the enterprise that everybody's going to benefit from. But actually, it's going to cost just as much to onboard all of these teams and retrain them for the future as it is to get the initial tech to do it, right?
Right.
It's a challenge.
So the other thing that you were talking about, and I think it's probably because I'm biased because I'm in the product world, but I do genuinely think you have people in product management who are bad at their jobs, and product managers get a bad rap for a reason that is a job title that means nothing. There's 40 different flavors of product manager. But if you have good product people, you want them in these conversations helping with the business context and helping figure out, like, that's just, it's one of those weird things. Again, I will always go back to the Office Space, which I haven't rewatched yet, so I'm not going to get any of the quotes right. But the Office Space joke of like the product person is just there to be in the way between the engineers and the client. And it's like, no, there's a skill set there with the good ones. And it's a matter of you don't want to work more than 40 hours a week. So why wouldn't you ask people to do things that they're good at for you so you don't have to? Having a product person who can come in and help you understand the personas, the business contacts, the clients, the metrics we're trying to tie to, all of those kinds of things are why you want them in that conversation so that you're not struggling to be like, oh crap, I've got to go and look up what's the revenue goal for this thing that we're talking about tomorrow. Just invite Sarah. She's the product manager for that business unit and will tell you all of that, hopefully. So I don't know, like it's one of those things where people feel like they're out in on their own, and then they are like, well, of course we didn't get to the business context because we didn't, that's not our job, and we didn't have any support for it. It's like, did you ask for support for it?
No, I love that you brought that up because actually it's funny. It's probably been the last 5 to 10 years. I'll tell you my favorite groups to work with: product and PMO. When people think, oh, it's engineering and the infrastructure guys, it's like, no, it's actually PMO and product, right? Because with product, when we get to and I love that you brought that up, by the way. Like as we start to look at like enterprise challenges with data, and you start to think about principles, like we haven't got into data mesh yet, but we will. If you start to think about some of the challenges around the old centralized world now, you're looking at the distributed data stacks, right? And once you get in there, you could be talking about like 5 different domains that have complex business processes, right? There's flows. And I often describe the challenge being for enterprise too is, if you get into a company where there's sort of a river, there's a flow to it. You're first of all, you got the sales guys and potential customers, and then you bring them in, the customers, and they fall through like a nice waterfall flow all the way through to the end. It's sort of easier to plan how those entities move across the bounded context. It's like, cool, this user looks like this here. And as they move through, they change because it becomes decentralized. But it's not that trivial in some enterprises because the entry point for the data can be here. So they're not working through like this natural downriver flow. It's like, well, they came in here, that's a completely different water system. So we have to now
Right.
move them over to this system. And that's challenging. Yeah, that's a challenge, I think. And it's exasperate, oh, what is that word?
Exacerbated or exasperating?
Exasperating, thank you, for
Yep.
the EA to be trying to understand those business workflows. Because a lot of the ideas behind distributed data products, right, is that the domains are the ones with the expertise. So we're not the
Yep.
best ones. Product are the best ones to talk about the business context, right? And the business process flows and stuff like that. PMO, because we're reaching into 7 different domains for stakeholders to say, hey, it seems like you
Right.
guys have a need for this concept, this requirement. So all 7 of you domains are now stakeholders, giving us your requirements for something that we're going to build. Coordination with those domains can be,
Yep.
yeah, that can be the challenge. So again, PMO there. But historically, that's been one of the biggest gaps that I've had a hard time closing is getting the PMO and selling that vision of like the enterprise services being part of the SDLC. In the same way DevOps is, right? Where it's like, hey, if we can get security architecture doing good automation around their scans, and then they're part of the process. There's potentially some tickets that they're taking care of as part of this process, and that's a challenge because again, those teams are not traditionally part of the SDLC, right?
No, I mean, that is DevOps, FinOps, SecOps. Everyone's trying to correctly insert themselves when you need to think of all of that kind of stuff. That's where, I mean, I'll pat ourselves a little bit on the back. Our version of how we go through the product life cycle has an explicit step where EA, UX, a bunch of people start getting looped in because I'd rather you be kind of bored for 30 minutes on a call than find out later that we screwed up and you were the only ones who recognized that this other business unit is doing the exact same thing and we just wasted 3 months of engineering time, not accounting for the fact that half that code was already written and needed to do more than we understood it to do. So yeah.
No, that's exactly right. Like I think most EAs would rather be in a meeting and say, no, that was really good informationally. I don't think there's anything for me to do here. 30 minutes,
Right.
30 minutes, right? Just to get eyes on something, learn something, and then pass it along and approve it and say, hey, there's, I couldn't add anything to this that improves the architecture. That's a great position to be in. And again, it's like, I always look at it like, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is what we have today. And it's like, a lot of companies
Right.
suffer just, ugh.
So, one of the things that they're asking here is what are the main outcomes and outputs of your role? So, how do you feel like you've had a successful day in EA?
So because I'm a hog, I like the idea of contributing to as much of the meta model. And when I think of the meta model, that's like if you imagine enterprise architecture, including business architects, a chief architect, let's say on the technology and application, maybe some data and mostly data application architects, right? But as long as you have that business architect there, like I would expect the outputs to be you're complementary to whatever product process you have. So I think the business architect is, and I don't want to, I don't feel comfortable enough throwing out fields and things that I would be augmenting the tickets with for the business architect. But I would assume there's output from the business architect around the time when product are starting to discuss the ideas, right?
Hmm.
And that's going to influence the technology architects as to the type of stakeholders that we're going to go after. I think for me and the other technical, sort of the technical disciplines outside of business architecture, we'd be looking at the design documents, and that would include diagrams, write-ups, challenges, checklists. Again, depending on your environment, our checklists tend to be distributed because the enterprise service teams are not together. So you get various checklists and approvals. So yeah, it's a mix of documentation. The design documents, that's where it starts to get interesting, right? Because I always like the sort of the transporters idea. You got the high level overview, and then you can turn a couple of layers on, and you start to get into the detailed overview. And if you can do a nice job of that, then you can sort of include your gateways, your NetOps infrastructure. I would expect all of that to be in the design documents as well.
Let me challenge
Yep.
you, go a level up. If you were going to write your performance review of the value you're adding to the company, what's the outcome? Why are all of those artifacts valuable and important, and what is the business getting out of it?
Yeah, so I think I don't know what the in the business world. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the life cycle in business as to how frequently they would do this. But for me, I find it like the different parts of the year, right? The beginning of the year when you're looking at your vision, I would assume that our outputs, like our meta model, if I'm on the business and I'm saying, and we use this example all the time, I'm going after LATAM, right? Then my meta model is going to be my first indicator of complexity, right? Like, what does that mean? Like, how many stakeholders, how many organizations, how many different pieces of technology? A well built meta model, kind of like the maturation level 4 or 5, that also includes, like, cool, that's got all my cloud costs for a platform for the next month. Like, I understand how much all the providers, I understand the uptime, right? So, my meta model is holistic. I can see that architecture and I can see the other business context that relates to. So essentially, if you were doing something like, oh, I'm going to retire this Oracle database, then for us, it's often, and I'll pick an arbitrary number, it's often saying, okay, it looks like a 6-month project, but it's actually a year and a half, and this is the breadth of it, right? So the planning, and I think, there's some pretty big projects that I've done in like aviation, network migrations, retiring data centers, sunsetting legacy, things like that at the beginning of the year. All of that planning should take into account the state of the architecture, right? So that one's flimsy because it takes you years to build that meta model.
Why does someone want a meta model?
I think it's all about the relationships, right? It's about the interfaces. So let's look at a simple meta model. I have application, I have a web application, and then I have some dated, decade old, not well supported application. But there's a relationship between them because the platform, the web application is calling into this black box. And in old companies, that is sometimes, like, it seems weird, right? But that is sometimes the challenge, is like the person who knows this tech is gone. And I think we've experienced that fairly recently, right? It's like, yeah, the
Hmm.
expertise in this tech is gone, right? So now we might not be at a level of maturation where we're able to forecast and project, but we know the challenge, right? We know, oh, we're looking at this and we have no idea what the scope is because the engineers have gone, and this is us looking at the code for the first time. But we know we have to deal with that code, right? And if we're dealing with that code, these are the 4 other services that when we actually do make the change to that code, we're not doing anything with these 4 other services, but we can't break them either, right? So now we're working with those stakeholders on their unit testing or their testing to verify. So it gets super complex with the sheer number of places that you can be benefiting, right? I think this is why often EAs are asked, like, stay narrow, then go broad. Convergence, technology convergence is a big one. So a good example is, people don't think about Salesforce and MuleSoft, same company, right? So a good example would be if I'm negotiating a contract for a MuleSoft tech or some other tech, but I'm also a customer of the enterprise for Salesforce, then in negotiating those two things individually probably doesn't make sense as a business. And actually is the difference between hundreds of thousands or millions, right, in your licensing renewals. So we would expect to be involved in procurement process, certainly around the fiscal side, but also the due diligence.
I think I'm trying to get to like what's the elevator pitch for someone for EA to understand whether they are hitting the mark or not.
Yeah, that's a fair one. Like the KPIs and stuff like that. Yeah, that's a good one.
Well, it's not even the KPIs. It is just like if you had to tell somebody you're allowed 2 sentences, you get 25 to 30 words to convince somebody that they're doing a good or a bad job in enterprise architecture. And you had to boil it down to the outcome, the
Yeah, yeah.
benefits, like what is the thing that you should feel like you've accomplished.
I'm kind of cheating because I'm going to give you two things that are loaded with other things. So it's kind of like
Sure.
you're increasing velocity. You're increasing the velocity through, and I shouldn't generalize and just say through simplicity, and then you're also reducing cost, right? You're reducing operational cost, and you're reducing, going back to that licensing example, you're reducing cost, whether it's capex, opex. But yeah, I'd say that's the two big things.
And so isn't I think it's interesting that people's perceptions of EA is that they are there to ask too many questions and slow things down, and yet your number one value statement is that they are supposed to speed things up. And so I just think there's an interesting just like industry. This isn't your problem. I'm not attacking
No,
you
no,
for
no, I
this.
know.
This is a perception thing that is somehow out in the industry about EA. And I think that's a fascinating, weird, I don't know that dichotomy is the right word for that, but right? It's a weird thing.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because I think you and I can be fairly down to earth and see the practical side, right? Like, so when you get to a company, you're sort of met with different levels of delusion or pushback, right? And the perfect storm is the person who thinks everything has been working great, right? And they're within their domain and everything works great and they don't understand why we're changing anything. And it's like, I've never worked in a big company where someone says everything is great, right? Because it never
Right.
is, right? It's like, cool. So answer me some fundamental questions. Why do you have four versions of the same implementation, right?
Right.
And the conversation should end there, right? Like the smartasses will fight and push back. Oh well, all big companies have that problem. Exactly, that's the problem. And if you think it's okay that all big companies continue to have this problem, what are any of us doing? We're building shitty
Right.
software, probably on shitty architecture, right? So yeah, you get various degrees of that, but they're the big savings, right? I often say this: the biggest savings are, or the best opportunities are sort of the invisible ones because it's when the company's been doing nothing for 5 years, innovative. It's all of that loss of 5 years that I point out and say that's our sweet spot because you haven't
Sure.
released anything in 5 years because this thing's it's a spaghetti. It's a nightmare, right? And then companies will often look at that data first and say, cool, we need to do this with our data. And it's like, good luck. The reason why you didn't innovate in the first place wasn't that you couldn't find the data or make sense of the data. Actually, your architecture doesn't support data moving, right? It's like you got 4 terabytes here that you're feeding off, but I need 1 terabyte of that data to be over here at 9 a.m. and it's here. It's geographically, it's constrained for me. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting challenges, but I'm yet to find any logical pushback where someone's given me a decent argument because the
Sure.
slowdown is maybe the wrong team's implementing their processes, but the slowdown is it should be the opposite.
So then, final question as part of this question is how do you balance between strategy and solutioning? Because at some point, you guys do also need to solution these things. But solutioning in an agile world, you're not supposed to do. That's supposed to be an engineering function.
Mhm.
And yet, you all need to be involved to make sure that the engineering team comes up with the right solution, right? Like it's a weird balancing act. How do you make your, like, do you care as an enterprise architect whether manager, you immediately jump to some solutions in your head, or are you I don't know, like product? I have to do the same thing as a technical product manager, is constantly tell myself like, no, 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 that's a solution.
So it's probably one of the most frequent conversations that I have with myself. This one, right? And it's never black and white. It's never true. It's never true for one, and then like, oh, cool, this one looks just like that one, so we'll do the same thing. Like, there's always like some weird nuance to it, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm solutioning inside my head, but I'm often critical and have been verbal with my team in the past in previous companies where I've been on calls with business guys, and you can sort of hear the pressure to, we really want to impress this business leader, right? So the solutions come out and it's like, stop, 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 stop. So I don't like to, I don't like to be on the call and throw solutions out, though I will admit quite often in the call, being a techie, it's hard to resist.
Right.
It is hard to resist.
Yeah.
And you're not necessarily solutioning. You might be trying to make a point of like, well, actually, this is not as, that piece of the architecture is not going to be as difficult because we can do this, right? I'll tell you the biggest complexity, and the reason why I talk to myself the most and why it's relative right now is when you're doing innovations, at very least to migrate and modernize, you've got the strangler fig. However,
Sure.
that's very difficult in a big company where the roadmap is tracked separately, because often you're strangler figging, but you're not strangler figging to the end solution. So I could say, I want to migrate from Postgres. So I'm going to have a change data capture on, and every time a record comes into the database, I'm going to flip it into Kafka. I got a connector and I'm writing it to SQL, and I'm going to migrate from Postgres, and SQL is going to be where I eventually move that data. So I can do that strangler fig and use Kafka to migrate that data as we go, right? But that's really, really hard when someone's telling you that SQL database is not ready. So you're going to do something temporary.
Right.
Until
You're strangler figging the strangler fig.
Yeah, you're strangler figging your strangler fig, and people are saying, what should we do? And it's like, whew, crikey. Like, I really am solutioning now, right?
Right.
So yeah, it's a challenge. Oh, let me say the one last thing on the enterprise architecture too is, and I think this is probably my compliment to Kevin in this episode, right?
I'll Venmo you after.
Yes. Enterprise architecture is a lot more powerful with the product and project partnership, right?
Yep.
And you're technical and business, and the world is so much better when you have a partner on the product side, because you can start to have conversations about, hey, I need an architect in at the earliest opportunity in the funnel, not so we can stop things, but because that business architect is going to send me off on a route that is 9 months of research. And so the quicker you can start to get an inkling of like the business architect is bringing something down that's going to require 2 of us to go do some research, the better. So that's the one that's often missing. You get to a company and you're building an EA practice, but the business architect is the one that you don't get. Why I like you is, even if I don't get a business architect, I get a lot of the coverage of a business architect because you can do that role as well.
Yeah, I mean, that is why I think technical product manager is a role that is far too rare, unfortunately, and I wish we found more of them, because it is that skill set that we should be investing in.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, good TPM. Oh my goodness. Because it's funny in a way too, like we talk about the partnership with the PMO. A good technical product manager can often reach into that PMing as well, right? Like, yeah, so it's really helpful. And they're in conversations that you're not in, so they know then, like, oh, that's a stakeholder. I remember we were talking about this the other day.
Right.
Like, they just think of things holistically as well. So I do like a good TPM.
Yep. All right, well, that's going to do it for us on this episode of Acceptance Criteria. To read articles that we've written on similar topics to the ones we talk about here, head over to the blog at acceptancepod.com. You can also follow us on most apps. We're at AcceptancePod. We'll post links to show notes and any articles from the blog over there.
We're also building a community on Reddit at r/acceptance criteria, or you can find us on Discord. Once there, you'll find links to show notes and other artifacts you'll find on our blog. We promise to moderate the heck out of anything submitted to the team to keep it a nice little slice of the internet.
For now, I'm Kevin Thomas Euland, and you can find me on most apps at ktomasuland. That's ULLAND.
And I'm Andrew Greener, and you can find me on most apps at Criteria Greener. That's GREINER, and this has been Acceptance Criteria. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you.